So with that, I want to introduce Laksh Bhasin, who has been very involved in the conversation around social housing here in San Francisco. And to introduce you, I wanted to think about sort of a question is that, you know, the San Francisco Berniecrats, along with Democratic Socialists of America and others, have really been promoting a left progressive vision of housing that is outside of the private housing market. So we'd love to hear from you, kind of your vision of what that social housing would look like sometime in the future, where you and I might be living in social housing, and to tell us a little bit about, in that work, how you think about that as being funded, designed, and built. Take it away, Laksh.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining. I hope you can see my presentation. My name is Laksh, and I'm here to present about what a public housing for all system could look like in San Francisco based on the research and advocacy work that we've been doing for the past 5 or 6 years. I want to first just start by mentioning how public housing abroad is a clear example of how governments can scale up a program to meet the needs of their residents. If you look at, for example, Vienna, Austria, 500,000 residents live in municipal social housing, which is publicly owned and operated, and that is a full quarter of the city's citizens in over 1,800 buildings. Another example is Singapore, a country that I actually briefly lived in, which has an ownership form of public housing, and that creates that at a rate of about 10 to 20,000 units per year. Meanwhile, in San Francisco today, just short of 10% of housing, about 30,000 units, is decommodified in some form, and that means kept off of the private for-profit speculative market. But less than 0.3% of housing is publicly owned and publicly operated. That's 1,000 units and fewer every single year. After years of federal budget cuts driven by racism and classism, SF's almost 8,000 units of public housing have been repeatedly privatized and turned over to either for-profit or nonprofit operators. And that dismantling of public sector infrastructure has almost rendered impossible the task of meaningfully guaranteeing housing as a human right. We need a large-scale way to be able to take a large amount of property off of the speculative market. This leads us to the next logical question, which is, what if we bring back public housing? What should it look like? Well, first of all, public housing, like with every other part of public infrastructure, such as schools and transit, has to be for everyone. It should be focused on providing a right to housing, not a return on investment as the market currently does. At the same time, it's not enough to create a service that's for all on paper, because it has to actually include the most marginalized in San Francisco. As one example, that means funding dedicated amounts of subsidies and housing for families of 4 whose income is below $40,000. They would qualify as extremely low income in the city. On top of that, the housing has to be affordable. Today, many tenants are paying over 50 to 60% of their income on rent. With local, well-funded public housing, that amount could instead be closer to 25 to 30% of their income on rent or mortgage. Public housing should also be truly public and involve community and resident input in decision-making from the building level all the way up to the department level in terms of setting the budget. And we also need good paying jobs and a new deal for workers. That means there have to be unionized public sector workers managing and maintaining properties. And one big benefit of doing this in the public sector is the stability and pension benefits that a public sector job provides. Less than 20% of private sector jobs today provide a defined benefit pension plan. And for most people my age, that is practically unheard of. On top of that, public housing must further a Green New Deal, including replacing natural gas with electricity. Climate change is the modern crisis of our times, and in San Francisco, we can use a city public housing program to deliver where the federal government is basically doing nothing at the moment. And finally, public housing should be well-resourced with nearby childcare centers or on-site childcare centers and frequent public transit, and also not segregated away from the rich neighborhoods of San Francisco. We need to create integrated housing for all. Now, to make this vision a reality, we worked to pass Prop K in November 2020, which authorized 10,000 units of public social housing. We had to do this because of a 1950 California ballot measure that requires a vote in a locality before even a single unit of public housing can be bought or built. That law, Article 34 of the California Constitution, is a segregation era relic that was passed with the help of realtors and private landlords, in part to kill public housing in its infancy. Prop K overcame that hurdle and got the most yes votes of any local SF ballot measure that year. It represents a clear mandate from 74% of San Francisco voters to create a public housing for all system. But unfortunately, its implementation has been delayed by the mayor's office. And our current mayor, London Breed's obstruction, is just one of the many reasons why public social housing shouldn't be run directly by the mayor. Folks may know about the Mayor's Office of Housing, the main housing agency in San Francisco. We faced several issues with this agency in getting social housing funds even allocated in the first place because it is subject to the mayor's political whim and has less oversight. The Mayor's Office of Housing also limits its own vision and role in housing development and isn't looking to actively shape the real estate landscape by managing its own public sector properties. On top of that, there is no oversight commission over this agency, and there's no inclusion of tenant voice in its governance structure. In the past, under federal public housing, the Housing Authority also suffered under the unique strong mayor system that we have in San Francisco. So this actually means that in order to fulfill the voter mandate represented by Prop K, we need a more democratic and dedicated department that is free from mayoral influence. And this is just one example of what a structure of that kind of a department could look like, drawing in part on some ideas that come from the community land trust setup. First of all, there should be a meaningful role for residents to play, directly chosen by residents without elected officials' interference. They can help set the budget and direction of the city's public housing based on their own actual lived experiences. There should also be a role for other financing or legal experts, public at-large representatives, and even public sector workers themselves. And these kinds of experts can be jointly appointed by the Board of Supervisors and Mayor. And these three branches can play a sort of co-equal role in overseeing a commission, which would serve as a public forum for the agency, choose the director as well, and also oversee funding and contracts. Fortunately, we have the money to get something like this started. Initial funds can come from Proposition I, and once they're residents, they'll pay rent or mortgage into the program's fund and operating budget. There's also a role here for a revolving loan fund, where loans are made out from the fund and the interest and principal payments are used to replenish the fund so that it can make out even more loans. I hope this presentation gave you all a sense of what the future of public housing for all can look like in San Francisco. I've included a link to our website that goes into a lot more of the details, and also a QR code that you can use to send a letter to the mayor and her budget staff. It takes just a few minutes to use the QR code and send an email, and that would basically be about funding all of these social housing recommendations put forward this year, including studies to set up a new department for public housing for all. Thank you, and I look forward to answering questions later.